Welcome to the Communicating Earth podcast by Climate Acceptance Studios. This is the podcast by and for climate and nature communicators. I was introduced to Jamil Wyne quite recently as we both share a passion for the importance of climate communication in solving the crisis. He has worked as a researcher, a consultant, a project manager, an investor, a guest lecturer for organizations as broad as the World Bank, Forbes, universities in 3 continents, and the International Rescue Committee. He's the founder of the Hazelwood Network. This is a global climate innovation company that supports climate entrepreneurship and investment around the world by creating new programs, organizations, and research that helps advance climate and sustainability goals and partnerships. Jamil, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom. Great to see you and looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. Okay, so firstly, we like to start with a bit of identification. So, how would you describe yourself? Are you an activist? Are you an advocate? Are you an entrepreneur? Are you an environmentalist? How do you identify yourself?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Well, I think you did a good job already of the introduction, so I might steal some of your words. I think of myself as, builder, advisor, educator, primarily, building these new programs, oftentimes in emerging markets, but also in the US to support early stage climate tech innovation, but also building new partnerships and consortiums like the one on extreme heat that we're going to be talking about a little bit more today. Advising that can come in the form of working with groups like the UN or the World Bank to help advise on strategy pertaining to climate tech and climate investment. I've done that with governments as well. And then when it comes to educating, I've taught at university, built a course for LinkedIn focusing on adaptation and resilience as well. So I also get to share these learnings and publish and lecture pretty widely on it too, which is a lot of fun. And so multi-hyphenated identity, I guess, is probably the best way to describe it.
I think the most common word there I heard was builder, though. Is that right? Or should it be a builder?
Yeah, I think so. I like to create new things. It could be new programs and projects, organizations, partnerships. It's always really exciting when you're going what we would call maybe in the startup space 0 to 1, when things are really messy at the beginning and you're not sure where they're going to go, but you're bringing lots of people and ideas together and something comes from it that you didn't expect. It's a lot of fun to go through that process, and there's a lot of us doing that in climate right now for sure.
And do you think there's enough building going on in the climate and nature movement? Or do you think there could be more?
Well, I think there's certainly a lot of gaps, right? So if you look at it from a decarbonization angle, the IEA says, a large percentage of the solutions that we need are still in labs, right, to hit our 2050 goals around, getting close enough to net zero and staving off the worst. We still have a lot of building, right? And that can mean taking companies that are in kind of research stage and prototyping them and getting into the market. It could also mean, bringing the talent together to help create these companies and investors together. So that 0 to 1 stage when it comes to decarbonization is still, there's a lot of room to be covered still, or ground to be covered rather. When it comes to adaptation and resilience, I think the gap's even bigger, where, there's only recently in the past 12 to 18 months have we talked about A&R a lot more in a kind of investment-minded, markets-oriented way, which means that we're aware now of the gaps from a funding angle, and we're also starting to get more aware of what needs to get built from a solutions angle. And I think there's also even more ground to be covered there. We don't have those numbers around A&R that we do around decarbonization and the demand for new technologies, but I would wager that they're quite enormous right now, which is an opportunity, but it's also a risk.
What about, maybe this is a bit controversial, but maybe we as a species have done too much building over the years, right? We've built too much stuff. We've created too much stuff. We've used up too many resources. So, or maybe you're talking about building in a sort of more esoteric partnership building way. What's your response to that?
Yeah, it's a good point, right? There's certainly movements around degrowth, and I do a lot of work at the World Bank, and their modus operandi is economic development creates jobs, jobs help generate incomes and lifts people out of poverty, right? So there is a growth mindset that's built into some of the biggest institutions in the world, right? Within our kind of sphere of working on climate, that is. What I would say is, let's put ourselves in the shoes, though, because I do a lot of work in emerging markets, one group of partners that I work with are in Senegal. Senegal is dealing with rising coastlines, right? And I've been to these coastlines. I've seen these homes literally disappearing before your very eyes and entire communities getting wiped out, right? Now, yes, building from a traditional, 19th century industrial revolution economic development angle, yeah, we did too much of that, right? We built too much, we broke too much, we burned too much in a non-sustainable way that drained natural resources and created new problems like the one that, you and I both work on. But at the same time, who are we to go to a group of Senegalese entrepreneurs and say, stop building things to protect your community, right? That's where I would draw the line pretty hard. Um, you know, we don't have jurisdiction over what other people do when it comes to taking care of themselves. And I think if they're doing it specifically from an adaptation and resilience angle, we need to help them, right? These are communities that are getting erased, people losing their homes permanently. Like the work that I do with the IRC, that involves building things too, right? You have to bring in drought resilient seeds, which means that somebody's got to create a company that creates those drought resilient seeds. You've got to distribute those to farmers. Those farmers need to continue to build their farms because without them, they would lose their livelihoods, right? And so I appreciate that there's a movement out there to remove this general economic capitalist growth mindset from the rest of the world to, as in hopes of staving off further damage. But I would also counter that with people will have to create new solutions, technologies in order to protect their homes and livelihoods, right? And so the person that can figure out the balance between those, I'm sure can get paid handsomely. It probably not me, but I would argue that there's still a lot of building that's left to be done, for better or for worse.
Yeah, and there's the justice ethical angle as well, isn't there? Loss and damage, uh, loss and damage uh, organizations, have, I think, quantified it as $2 trillion a year, and that we are obliged morally to pay to the global south because we benefited from burning all this carbon in the way they haven't. So, I mean,
Yeah,
where does that
I would
fit
just
into
say
your
just
work
to
then?
I would say just to add to that real quick. I mean, you're right. Loss and damage has become kind of the poster child movement, right, for understanding this kind of divide between wealthy countries and less wealthy ones. But it's also happening in wealthy countries, right? I mean, Tulane University just came out with a study that Louisiana is essentially out of time, right? And that's home to a lot of people. That's home to a lot of wealth. And so those people have to leave, right? And as soon as they leave, they will move into new communities that are maybe not built to absorb them. And so there is an economic incentive, right, to figure out how do you absorb migrating populations, which is also going to be a theme. So I just wanted to add that because it's often colored as kind of a global north versus global south, but it's also going to happen within the borders of wealthy countries, and it already is.
I mean, I could talk about this for the entirety of the podcast, but let's be focused. Let's be focused. So this podcast is based around the principle that it's, which is more than a principle, it's social science, that it is stories of action that inspire action, and we're all about inspiring action in this space. So, what is your tale of action you want to bring today, Jamel?
Sure, sure. And I credit you for helping guide me to this because sometimes when I have all these different stories to tell, I want to say them all at once. So the one that I think I'm really excited about right now, and I think we're seeing this play out in real time, you could Google, I think, any major metro area in the world right now, and then type the words extreme heat next to it. There's probably a headline news grabbing article at the moment that is talking about the rising temperatures, how those are affecting everything from air quality to transportation to healthcare issues to just general ease and comfort of life, right? So extreme heat is a way that most of us on the planet are going to experience climate change. We used to think of it as something that comes far off in the future. We're realizing it's actually happening right now in real time. And so that's an issue that I've been focusing on a lot over the past year or so. Where this dovetails with the climate communications work is, we've never really had to think about how do we talk about and educate people on extreme heat. We're used to thinking, okay, you just turn up the AC. We're realizing in real time that it's not as simple as that. One, not everybody has AC, even in some of the wealthiest countries. Two, AC also is an emitter of GHGs. And three, it's not a sustainable solution in general, right? And so we're realizing that extreme heat, not only is it a real and present threat, it's one that we don't really have a solution set for, at least at scale. And so that is, for me, as a communications problem/opportunity. And so Hazelwood, fortunately, has teamed up with some really amazing organizations in the US to start trying to crack this issue of how do we educate people on extreme heat. And in doing so, how do we then equip local leaders with the knowledge to actually go out and talk about extreme heat and help prepare their populations for not just what's happening right now, but what's going to be happening in the future. And what we found is quite interesting. And I can go into a little more detail in how we did it if that would be of use here, but also happy to,
Very
if
much
there's
so.
other
Very
questions.
much so.
Yeah, exactly. I just want to make sure I wasn't jumping ahead too far.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, so the way it started is we last year were working with a foundation to kind of diagnose the landscape of communications around climate, figure out who's doing what are the big trends, what are the big challenges, and what we found was there's a big gap when it comes to educating people and communicating the importance of adaptation and resilience. Extreme heat is oftentimes one of the kind of key ways in which people are going to experience climate adaptation risks. And so what we found was that there's, as I said, very little education on it. And so what we did first was came up together with a consortium of organizations. One is Climate Mayors, which is the kind of largest national group of mayors in the US that focus on climate. There's over 300 mayors represented within the network, and they're really amazing team that helps the mayors do everything from navigate the politics around data centers to when the IRA was in kind of full swing, how to educate their populations on getting in on different tax breaks and incentives around that, right? So Climate Mayors plays a really important role in just being this information hub and kind of advisor in some ways and convener of different mayors focusing on climate. The other group that we teamed up with was called Northwind Climate, or now they're called Switch 5, political polling consulting company that does a lot of work on climate. And so they were founded by a handful of former advisors to Tom Steyer, who's run for president and governor, and he's one of the biggest climate philanthropists and investors in the US. And so what we did was we said, look, in order for us to really understand what mayors need to be saying, so if mayors are the voice box, they're the trusted messengers on the ground that are in the communities working on kind of day in, day out with their populations. Obviously not, climate is not the only thing they're worried about, but particularly right now, at this point in time in history of this year, extreme heat and climate is going to the front of their agendas very quickly. And a lot of the times I think we're all being caught off guard by it. So what Northwind did or Switch 5 was two very, very large surveys across the US, almost 6,000 people polled all together in a handful of major metro areas to understand their perceptions around extreme heat. Like, so do they know what the term is, right? We use it a lot, but people really understand what it is. The other is, do they find themselves adequately informed on how to deal with it? If not, how would they like to be informed? Who do they want to get informed by? What are the communication channels that they should be using to get that information? And so then Climate Mayors takes that information and boils it down into a set of talking points, strategies, kind of what to say, what not to say, so to speak, fact sheets, et cetera, that gets sent around to the national network of mayors. And then those mayors take it and they start actually implementing it. So when these extreme heat warnings are happening across the US, the mayors now have a guidebook, so to speak, of what to be doing in terms of communicating the risks and getting their populations prepared for it. And so we're right now in the kind of first iteration of getting it out the door. All the surveys have been wrapped up. Version 1 of the toolkit went out already. Version 2 is on its way. And so we're hoping by the fall, we're going to have what will be, I think, the US's first and maybe even the world's first strategy on how to communicate extreme heat nationally. And we're hoping that's just the starting point, because that can lead to more work on heat, but can also lead to more work on adaptation and resilience risks that these communities are facing.
Fantastic. So a man off my own heart, disrupting, bringing together two groups that would normally work together. I loved all that sort of stuff. So is this you? Was this your idea? Did you come up with it?
So we lucked out. I contributed a portion of the idea.
You keep saying
Yeah,
we.
yeah.
Who's we?
So I would say the consortium of partners, right? So on one hand, and this was serendipity, right? We were doing this study, as in Hazelwood was doing this study on communications in climate, largely speaking, right, across the US. We met Northwind as part of that research, and then in parallel, we were also meeting the climate mayors, right? And so we originally talked to them in the effort to just learn from them, right? Northwind obviously has a ton of insight because they're surveying people across the country on different climate opinions and different risks that they're facing. And we learned a lot from that. Climate Mayors is actually working with local politicians, and we learned a lot from them on communications, toolkits, and skills. What we learned along the way was that Climate Mayors, unbeknownst to us, had created a working group around extreme heat. So they had brought together a consortium of, I think, 20 to 25 mayors within the larger network that was focusing on extreme heat. And so when we found a corporate funder who was interested in this work, originally our work was being funded by a foundation, we met a corporate funder that was also interested in this. And they said, look, we'll let you all kind of figure out what you think the main risk area is, where our new comms toolkit could be most impactful. But we think extreme heat's quite interesting too. And so that's why I say the serendipity kicked in, because independent of me, even though Hazelwood helped in bringing these different parties together, because we were speaking with each one of them independently, including the funder, we were all thinking about extreme heat risk in parallel. And so when it came time for us to sit down and build out the strategy document, literally saying, let's put pen to paper on what we want to build here with each other, it was really easy, fortunately. And I think Mother Nature is the ultimate forcing function here. We all knew that extreme heat was going to be a big risk in 6 months' time, because this is what we do for a living. So I think that also helped push this over the finish line and get us all on the same page.
So was there a moment when you suddenly realized that you'd all been independently working on this topic and you were aligned? Was there like a moment in a meeting or a sort of excited email chain? I mean, how was that discovery made?
Yeah, and I'm going back into the archives because it was around this time last year, actually, that it started coming together. I mean, I think what we realized was, one, we all were still reeling from the IRA getting kind of pushed in the back, dismantled, paused, whatever you want to call it, right? And so there was almost this gap in the US. I'm like, well, what do we say now about climate, right? Because the thing that we were all talking about for so long was, you can, get tax breaks if you're installing solar, right? You can, your community can be installing more EV charging systems, right? There was this movement happening and a lot of economic incentives driving that movement. And so when we couldn't focus on that any longer, there was this gap of like, well, what do we prioritize? And so one of the aha moments was, wait, we actually have a window now, because the thing that we were really going to be talking about and working on all independently, that was driving a lot of work, isn't there any longer. And so that was the kind of domino one, I think. And that happened independently from all of us. I think domino two was that when we talked to this corporate funder, they said, well, we have a big interest in disaster response. And they were defining that very broadly. And they gave us enough room to say that could mean any number of things. Adaptation and resilience certainly falls squarely within that. Could we potentially put together a concept? What they also said that they are very interested in figuring out how do local politicians deal with these issues, because as a large kind of tech firm that funds these types of projects, they had an interest in figuring out what the ground reality looks like with mayors and their constituents on a daily basis. And so it was probably a series of like 4 to 5 conversations, right, where I was hopping on the phone with the Northwind team, then I talked to the climate mayors, and I talked to the funders, and then I talked to some different experts in the space, until we realized, wait, I think we're all kind of saying the same thing here, right? And what was really amazing was that everybody is coming at this from a different angle, right? We have the data collection team that's thinking about, well, what are the questions you need to ask to really understand what an average citizen in the US is worried about when it comes to extreme heat? The mayor's team thinking about, mayors have literally 3 minutes in a day to be thinking about these issues, right? How do we equip them with the right information right off the bat so that they can take action quickly? And me, I'm thinking, how do we bring this all together in a way that gives all the different parties what they're looking for and also allows us to move forward? And fortunately, the partners have been amazing, and I've been really lucky to work with them.
So you were the matchmaker, ultimately. You were the guy that brought everyone together.
Yeah, matchmaker. But I think what was great was that everybody was already thinking along these lines. And so when I said, have you thought about this yet? And talking to them, they said, essentially, yes, but I'm glad that you're coming in now and bringing us together. So that was my role, as being the kind of convener and herder of the entities here. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to circle back a bit. So, so we did this big survey of climate and nature communicators back at the start of the year, and surprise, surprise, like one of the biggest pain points that everyone is facing is funding. And you've just gone, yeah, I just started speaking to this funder, and you've just gone, yeah, dust that off. Like, for our audience, that is, potentially, a multi-year project to get to the stage where they can land funding, right? So, how did you start speaking to that funder? What was the process? Did you cold approach them? Were you referred? I mean, how did that come about?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've been I'm an advisor to a lot of different groups, right? And so um, I sat on a committee at one of these entities that I'm an advisor to. They're an accelerator here in the US. Sat on the committee. Coincidentally, a member of that corporate philanthropy team was also on the committee. And I originally thought when I approached them that we were going to be talking about supporting climate entrepreneurs in emerging markets, mainly for two reasons. One, that's a lot of what I do focuses on that. But two, the committee itself was built for that purpose, where we were advising on programming to support entrepreneurs in emerging markets that are working on climate in some shape or form. So I thought we're probably going to, if we have anything to talk about, it's going to be let's trade insights on how do you support new companies, how do you grow them, how do you get them over the hurdle of sales and fundraising, et cetera. Classic kind of 101 issues in working with companies, new companies that is at that stage. They didn't want to talk about any of that, funnily enough. So all the stuff that I typically do, they weren't really interested in. And to be frank, I was kind of grasping for straws at one point. I was like, okay, well, this is what bulk of my work is. Here's some other stuff I'm doing now. And I mentioned climate communications, and they said, well, tell us more. And I said, why do you want to know about my comms work? I was still learning so much in the field anyway. And it turns out to their credit, were taking a really, really systematic approach to thinking about how do we build stronger networks of communication around disasters and emergencies. So they have a mandate to do a lot of kind of capacity building and field building on this, and they're testing a lot of different issues and different approaches to that. And when they said, "Oh, communications, that's interesting. What have you been learning?" and I threw out the name Climate Mayors because I had recently talked to them, and they said, "Well, we'd love to meet them." And I said, "Are you sure? Because this is the stuff that nobody ever asks me about." And so, lo and behold, it was very timely, very fortuitous. And then once we started having the calls, I think what lended a lot of credibility, to be fair, is Northwind is very respected. Climate Mayors is very respected. I just was the guy that brought it together. But those two groups have been doing really important work for a while. They just needed somebody to introduce them to the funder, I think, and kind of connect the dots. And that's where I came in.
But really good that you also have got like lots of irons and lots of fires. You're juggling all these balls, and you just presented the new one, right? I think that's admirable. Really
Thank
good,
you.
really good. That's a really good story. Okay, so you've been matchmaker and you've brought them all together. This is something that I've done myself. Like what? So, for example, what are the politics around like introducing people via email? How much do you think about like the use of CC and, dare I say it, BCC in your work?
I guess there's this tendency to err on the side of over communicating. Like that's usually how I work. I'm an introvert by design, and so reaching out to people is sometimes very difficult for me, I'll admit. I would say reaching out and then knowing how to gauge their response because everybody's so busy, everybody's juggling a million things, to the credit of all three of the groups that are involved in this project, in addition to Hazelwood, people would make themselves available, right? Which I think is critical here, which we don't say enough sometimes because everybody's got an agenda that goes beyond 9 to 5, right? And so for somebody to come in and say, I have this new idea, could we take 30 minutes to chat about it? Like that could be a tall ask for busy people, right? And so I think on one hand, just building communication channels, ironically, for a communication project was new for me, right? Because
Okay.
I'm used to being the guy that says, great, here's our funder, here are entrepreneurs, let's go work with them, right? Let's help them get to the next stage. This was funder wants this, entity X wants that, entity Y wants that, where's the common ground, right? And fortunately, everybody's awesome. And so we found the common ground without too much issue. But, it took time of feeling everybody out and figuring out, one, how do we align, things as simple as how do we align schedules, right? Who gets, as you said, who gets CC'd and BCC'd on this? Who takes the lead in conversations, right? Just because one person brings in the funder or a partner doesn't mean that you always own that relationship, and you have to know how to be collegial and bring more people in and make sure that people are heard and that we're structuring meetings in a certain way that gives transparency and whatnot. And these are things that I took for granted, right? Because I would just say, everybody gets it, right? And sometimes when you're making assumptions, you're actually creating more distance. And so I had to do a lot of checking of my own assumptions when I was bringing different people together for things as simple as just getting us all to weigh in on a concept note, right? That turned out to be a critical step, but one that it was just new to me, right? Of how to bring them all together. And so I admit there had to be a lot of improvisation, and in hindsight it worked, but at the time I was doing a lot of improv, I'll say.
And so was there, I mean, I've been there myself on concept note. So was there lots of toing and froing? Were some people disappointed by the direction that the project had taken, and how do you manage that?
So like I said, we were really fortunate and have been fortunate to date that everybody kind of agreed from the beginning, like, okay, comms gaps are, how would I say, quite bountiful right now when it comes to climate. Extreme heat, big blind spot, right? So when it came to getting everybody on the same page about the importance of the issue and how we wanted to go about building this new toolkit, it wasn't hard, right? I think everybody was on the same page that this general approach made sense. I think the barriers weren't that we faced, and we still face them. It's, how do you then take this very robust research exercise, right, and give it to a group of really, really busy political leaders, right, that are worrying about everything from, new data centers getting created to upcoming elections and fielding various critiques, complaints, concerns from their communities on a daily basis. I think that is where, and it's not so much unique to what we're doing right now, because I think a lot of groups are facing this. There's a ton of really good work being done in climate communications in the U.S., and I'm sure you see it too, in on your side of the ocean, Tom. But figuring out how do you convert a really amazing communication guide to action, right, for us, I think
Exactly.
is a fun work in progress, right? And I think we're learning as we're doing it, right? But coming back and saying we nailed it, right? We're not there yet, right? And I think that's been difficult, not because of differences in opinions. It's more because we all have to learn together, right, about what this looks like, and we have to do what we can in the amount of time we have with the resources we have to get action done, right? And so again, this is less an issue that we're facing as a consortium and more, an issue because of who we are. It's more just the facts of the matter that it's very difficult sometimes to convert this into real world action. And as I said, we're learning it as it happens.
Are there any learnings that you can tell us about that other people could pick up and use in their own analogous projects? What have you learned so far?
Yeah, a couple things. So one is that I think when it comes to building comm strategies, something that we found was that there's still this kind of preference globally for finding like a message that resonates with everybody, right? And we explored that a lot, right? And this is even before we started with this project. And what we've realized as we've gone, especially because we've done, because Northwind or Switch 5 has done the surveys, I think we've just learned a ton that the way that these issues get experienced can vary significantly from household to household, right? And so figuring out one message that resonates with everybody is just really difficult. The other thing is, I think, and I've seen this and I've done this too, we sometimes want to communicate all of climate change at once. And what we realize is that it looks very differently when it comes to the way that different neighborhoods are facing it, different countries, different businesses, et cetera. But also people respond to, the consequences of it differently. And so what we're finding is that kind of who is the messenger counts for a lot, but also what is the specific risk area you're trying to educate people on. And even when you're educating them on extreme heat, which if you think about it as a funnel, you start with communicating all of climate, then moving to adaptation and resilience, then moving to heat. You think you've gotten really specific at that point, but then you realize, wait a second, heat can affect your body itself, right? It can affect sleep patterns, it can affect your respiratory system, et cetera, and plethora of other ways. It can also impact infrastructure and plant life, and it can affect transportation systems, et cetera. So you start peeling away the onion and realize, wait, we may not even be getting specific enough, right? With how this is affecting people in real time, in neighborhoods and communities in real time. So that's been one big lesson, right? Is like, how do you tailor a message to a really particular audience? And also, who are the personas, right? One thing that we've had to working with a great comms team as we put this together is, who are the different personas that we're really talking to here? And that's been a learning experience, right? There's the single mother, right? There's the physician, there is the son in the family, right? Like, these are different profiles of different people in these communities that are going to respond differently, depending on what the message is. And so that's been a big takeaway for us as well, is being very specific with what you're saying, targeting certain personas, but also being ready to get surprised, right? Because we're also finding there's a lot of use cases with the toolkit beyond just supporting the mayors. And that's also been part of the fun of this project, I think, where the impact in the long run is going to be felt.
So the challenge is focus, to sum up in brief, would you say?
Yeah, there we go. Said much better. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because credit goes to the legions of skilled communicators like yourself, right? That are out on the front lines, documenting and learning and spreading the knowledge that you're gaining. And I think at the same time, for us, we're like, wait a second, let's take all that amazing momentum that groups are building around climate comms and just carve out a little piece, right, that we want to focus on for now. Partially because I think we'd be stepping on other people's toes, right? Like, that's another thing to say out loud, right? There's a lot of amazing work being done in this space, but we realize that, especially with the gaps around A&R communications, it's good for us to get really specific and focused, which for me is always hard, but worth it once you do it.
Okay, let's return to that in a second. Like, really fascinating conversation. A&R, for the audience, by the way, is adaptation and resilience. Just for those who don't know, I'm sure you do, but I just thought I'd qualify that. Okay, so we have now what we call the quickfire round, although the quickness of it is sometimes up for debate in the history of this podcast. But let's see whether you can keep your answers, reasonably brief. So, Jamil, are you ready?
I am ready. I'll do my best.
So let's start off with some word association. What's the first word that comes to mind when I say climate?
Navigation. So figuring out, how do you navigate this series of risks globally? Yeah.
A new answer. Very good. Very good. Who is your greatest inspiration in the climate and nature communication sector?
It's a tough one. This might be an unoriginal answer, but I really like Jane Goodall. May she rest in peace, right? I loved that from day one, this is what she did. I love her story of kind of happening into it. And so the authenticity, originality of it's amazing. But also, I don't think she ever deviated from her message, right? And, till the day she passed was sticking to it. And so I just love it. Yeah.
Yeah, my team filmed her last ever public performance.
Oh, amazing. Okay. So you've seen it firsthand. I've just observed it from afar.
What a privilege. Is there someone's work out there who you think should receive more attention?
Oh, absolutely. Look, there are, right now as we're talking, right, there are thousands of entrepreneurs across, let's say, the global south, emerging markets, right, that are in resource-constrained environments, very climate vulnerable environments. And so I think of anybody that is building right now, right, a new company focusing on adaptation and resilience, like, your community needs you, right? We don't know them usually because it's hard to reach these geographies. So my kind of inspiration, where I get a lot of inspiration for my work from is those people that are building right now.
And one specific entrepreneur that springs to mind that you can tell the audience about?
Well, he's an entrepreneur and investor. He's an old friend was really instrumental in getting me into this. I didn't tell him I'd be talking about him on the show, but his name is Enes Ramawi, a really brilliant climate investor from the Middle East who's been in this space for, I think, about 2 decades now, as an investor and a developer. And he's been great at just educating me on the issues. And I started my career in the Middle East and got a chance to meet Enes when I was living in Jordan. and still stay in touch with him and go to him with a lot of big questions. And so I hope more people know about the work he's doing, because Middle East is a very, very climate vulnerable region, and he's been at the forefront for a long time of doing a lot of important work there.
What's your favorite piece of culture, like a book or a movie or a TV show on the sector on climate?
So I'll cheat a little bit here. A good friend of mine in college made a movie on sustainable fisheries and the impact of climate change on fishing communities in the South Pacific. It was called Fading into Blue. And it was the first time anybody in my immediate circle of friends had really worked on climate. And in a previous life, I was a musician. And so he asked me to write the soundtrack for it. And so I got to kind of enter the climate field that way, which was really interesting. Most of us, studied it or worked at a startup or an NGO, and I wish I could say that, but this was writing music for my friend's documentary on it. And so I just inadvertently got involved that way and learned a lot in the process, and still, occasionally listen to the music too, which is nice.
Amazing, amazing. What's your favorite communications channel?
I'm going to cheat a little bit here again. I think one-on-one conversations like this, Tom, as much as I wish I could figure out that right set of messages and kind of language to get the message out at scale, I'm just such a big believer in the one-on-one conversation, right? It's hard sometimes to resist the urge, but as an introvert, I do much better in those circumstances too.
I would, and that's the most common answer, by the way, in this
Oh,
podcast.
good.
But
I'm not cheating then. Good.
so no cheating there. But it's not the most effective, isn't it? Because we need mass social change. So for mass social change, what do you think is the most effective communications channel?
So this is maybe again cheating a little bit, but but I think at the end of the day, there's a certain group of individuals that are probably, and I think about this from the angle of kind of global leaders that are working in parts of the world that are either not getting their story told, right? Or they're only getting one version of the story, right? So I think that there's a huge role to be played around the kind of sovereign wealth funds of the world, the different ministers of state in the global south, right, that are dealing with these issues in real time. And I think that there's a very, very underexplored, untapped opportunity to be communicating directly with them, not purely from a climate justice angle, because that is important and it needs to keep going. But I don't see anybody talking about adaptation and resilience investment solutions with this community, right? And that has to change ASAP. It's an urgent need. Survival depends on it. And so I would think very well kind of structured learnings, workshops, et cetera, focusing on A&R investment and action plans is going to be needed in spades across emerging markets. And I would push hard for anybody that wants to enter this space in a formidable way to think about that.
Interesting. What's your favorite stat or fact about the climate nature crisis?
Yeah, so there's a good risk within the next, I think, 15 to 20 years that like 2.2% of labor hours could get lost as a result of extreme heat. I need to double check that, but in essence, that's tens of millions of jobs lost, huge sums of money that get wiped out just because of that, right? It doesn't take much for the temperature to change for it to become not just uncomfortable but have damage, and I think we're just waking up to that. And so any statistic that shows this slight kind of, when I say 2.2% doesn't sound like that much, right? But this slight increase in temperature and just how debilitating it can be, I think we just don't realize it half the time. And so it's a sobering statistic, but it's an important one.
Do you have a favorite analogy or metaphor when you're trying to explain the climate nature crisis to somebody?
Well, I have an analogy that it should be used. Sorry, that should be used, and I think one that often gets used that I would advocate we stop using. So the
Okay,
one that
interesting.
yeah, so the one that I think we often use is that we talk about climate a lot as a game. Like we'll win this eventually. We'll defeat this. Like we'll wake up one day and it'll be gone. And I think it's this human tendency to break things into binaries. And the way I think about it is that climate is a fact of life now. Like climate change is a fact of life. We have to learn how to navigate it. And so the analogy that I would like us to start using more of is, sailors on the sea, on the ocean, right? They don't defeat the ocean, they don't own the ocean, they don't purchase it, they don't monetize off of it. They have to figure out how to get from point A to point B and protect themselves and their ship. And so that's why I use the word navigation, because for the longest time we've talked about climate as this thing that could, climate change that is this thing that will like disappear at some point. And I, not to be a downer, but I think it's something that we have to learn how to navigate. Otherwise, we're going to be waiting for something to happen that I'm not convinced can happen.
I couldn't agree more. And to put a hopeful slant on it, like I think that we are like really, really, really terrible proactive animals, like terrible proactive animals. But we're also conversely really brilliant reactive animals. Like we're really, really good at adaptation. And I'm just hoping that, as we adapt, because it's a truly global unifying thing, it's going to be a thing that's going to bring the whole species together. Because we have to realize that we're going to do it. We have to do it if we're going to solve it. And that, so that's my hope.
I like the way you said it. I would agree too. Yeah.
So, okay. So let's go back just to touch briefly again on the project. So, which obviously is not complete, but how are you going to measure the impact? I suppose it's the extent to which the mayor's changed the policy, right? Is that going to be the measurement, or is it going to be on then to, public awareness or businesses changing their practices or what have you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we can break up the, let's say, anticipated impact into two different categories here. There's the ones that we think could happen or should happen, right? And the ones that are going to be the nice surprises along the way. I think what we want to see happen and this is going to sound a little simplistic here, but like, are people reading it, right? Are people reading and downloading it, right? It sounds silly, right? But first we want to know that from an output angle, people are actually just accessing it, right? And so simple tracker in place to check that, right? And we see it happening already. Then, media mentions or newspapers picking it up. And we're seeing that happen now too, right? Where journalists are saying there's this new toolkit that's being built, and they'll also go out and talk to mayors about the toolkit, get their opinion on it. And so that's happening already too, which is great. And so when it comes to like near term outputs, we're seeing some like preliminary green flags, right? That there's receptivity and there's demand for it. What we also had going for us from the beginning, which is one area that we could get this project over the finish line and bring everybody together for, and it's related to that last point, was there was already a lot of demand for it, right? And this is where kind of the brilliance of the climate mayors team comes in, because they're talking to the mayors on a regular basis and saying, well, what are you worried about, right? What do you want to learn when it comes to climate risk? And for them, a lot of people in their network, a lot of leaders in their network that are asking for more information on extreme heat and how to deal with it. And so we know already, kind of going into this, that there's appetite for it, which leads us to kind of what you were saying. There, I think, will inevitably be not necessarily new policies, but maybe new protocols, right? New strategies of informing people. And we're in the midst of extreme heat season in the U.S., right? And you're probably, watching it on the news, right? We're hoping and we're anticipating, and we're already getting kind of data sent back to us that people are using this in real time, right? And so whether that leads to, what we would hope is, long-term protocol changes and policy changes, et cetera, those take a while, right? So we don't want to say that it's imminent, right? But I think it's a lot more likely because we're seeing near-term uptake and appetite for it. That's category one of like what we think can happen as a result of this, and we're seeing it slowly play out. Category two is the fun surprises, so to speak, that come up with it, right? Where you have this big data set, and you've probably seen this in your work too. You're like, this data can be used for XYZ reasons or areas. And then somebody comes along and says, well, have you considered these other use cases, right? So what we haven't done at all yet, for instance, is take this to employers, right? So the mayors obviously have a vested interest in protecting their populations. Employers have a vested interest in protecting their staff. We haven't thought yet about how could this be used by employers to develop new heat protocols, right? What should they be communicating to their staff? How do they keep them informed? How do they respond? As you said, when they react after the fact, how do they do it in a way that makes sure their employees are feeling heard and informed and protected. And so I think there's also just going to be a lot of use cases around that we're just starting to scratch the surface on, that are going to show us that the impact is real and it's legitimate, but it's going to be in areas that I don't think we anticipated, which is, it's a little bit hard to plan for those, but I think it's also really important to keep in mind as we're implementing it.
I mean, again, we could talk for ages, but we must remain vigorous in the structure of the podcast. There'll be obviously links in the show notes to all of this amazing work. And I'm sure people could reach out to you, Jamil. Is that right? I mean,
Happy to.
the ability to. Okay, so let's finish off for the final section, which is just like your opinions more generally. So, I mean, how do you see the future of the climate nature communications sector?
So I think sometimes we forget that it's still a young sector, right? It's, I remember when we were doing this project with the foundation last year, we found out that as like a social science, we didn't start talking about climate communications, I think, until like the late 90s, right? So we're still really early on, right? And so I think when it comes to thinking about what's going to happen next, a few things that, this is what I hope to see happen. One is, I think there's going to have to be a lot more specificity, right? I think we're graduating from how do we communicate climate writ large, to how do we educate people on specific risk areas and what they mean for them, right? And you've obviously a big fan and have benefited from knowing John Marshall from Potential Energy Coalition and the great work that they do. They came out with that great research on, I think it was like G6 countries, where they polled, I think, 80,000 plus individuals across those countries and learned that, talking about net zero isn't really pushing the envelope forward. People aren't really responding to it, which means in my mind that we have to get really specific with the consequences and the risk areas. And my hope is that the climate comms world moves more into that. The other thing is, I think we still are, and this was something that we did when we were originally kind of mining the ground and for insights on climate comms writ large. I think something that we found was that the tools we're using are still kind of old, right? We're still relying on somebody gives an epic speech, right? Somebody writes a really profound op-ed, and we need those. Those are always going to be in demand and they have use, right? But what we're seeing also is that there's a lot of interesting things you can do with communications and rapid message testing, et cetera, using AI, right? And I think there's a lot of room, especially with the advent of AI, to be thinking critically about how it can be used for everything from, as I said, rapid message testing, to collecting information faster and responding to it, right? So there's just a lot of tools in the toolkit, so to speak, that I think AI can help with, that we're just starting to understand, and it's something that we documented in our research that led up to the work on extreme heat. The other thing is, I think that there's a tendency, and this is me stepping less into my shoes as the climate communications guy with the work we've been talking about, and more the emerging market focused person. The story is still, I think, very Western dominated when it comes to talking about climate change. And I think if you go spend time, not you personally, but like if we were to spend more time in, Senegal, in Mexico, Bangladesh, et cetera, all places that I work in or have worked, the story around climate change looks very, very different, right? There's a lot of countries that still rely heavily on fossil fuel production, for instance, that if you were to take that away from them, the country could disappear, right? Our narrative in the West around kind of how to approach that issue is just very different than they see it. And so this is not me advocating for continued production of fossil fuels or for accepting the norm. I think that obviously has to change, but how we tell that story to the people in these countries, I think, needs to evolve as well. And that's something I just haven't seen mastered yet, and I don't have the answer for it. Right? I think that's where we have to bring our different heads together and put some new thoughts on the page, because the story to date is pretty heavily skewed towards one viewpoint, and I think we need to be thinking a lot more critically about how people experience it in other countries that may not see it the same way as us. And that's the way we bring us all to the table and get good work done.
Yeah, I think it's the phrase, the just transition, right?
Yeah.
So, and if we can pull that off, we're going to be solving so many other problems at the same time, and, go towards the Star Trek Next Generation future that I still believe is possible. Now, this next question is obviously not so relevant to you because you are someone who definitely does follow and apply the science of communication. So why don't we widen it to what extent, in your experience, do you see um, both your work and other people's work in the science of climate communication being adopted more widely by the sector? I mean, my opinion is I think at times people are still sort of stuck in their ways, and they've been in this sort of 30-year rhythm of what they do and just rinse and repeat. Are people waking up to all this amazing work of all of these researchers and all of these focus groups? And do you get a sense that people are adopting it more and more and clicking out of those sort of 30-year-old climate communication habits?
Yeah. I think and I hope maybe that's that's a way to say it. Because I know you do it and you get it, right? And I know John gets it, and other partners and groups that we've mentioned during this call do. I think that what I find refreshing is, and maybe I just work in an echo chamber, right? But I hear a lot more people talking about the importance of the messenger, right? And I think if we take a step back, we could probably count on like one hand, maybe two max, who the go-to messengers around climate were for the past several decades, right? Those aren't by any means ineffective messengers, but they could only do so much, right? So many people in my circle, got into this work because of Al Gore, right? And like what he's doing to just encourage climate action, or Jane Goodall, right? Or Bill McKibben, right? Or Johan Rockstrom, right? These heroes of that came from the previous generation, right? Many of which fortunately are still with us doing incredible work, but they're not necessarily the only voices that people want to hear from. And so my hope is that, one, there's going to be a whole new generation of messengers, right? And I think, and these messengers need to be partnered with in a very smart way. It's not just about loudest voice wins. It's about the most trusted voice, I think. And how do we build trust right now is one of the reasons. It's kind of an unspoken goal of this project that we were talking about earlier, where if we talk about climate broadly, it's going to be harder for people to trust us because it's such a big topic that can mean so many different things. But if we talk about heat, which is something that's affecting everybody right now, we can very quickly get on the same page and build trust. And so I haven't heard people talking about that much until recently. And it's not because of our project, I think it's just part of this larger waking up of institutions that aren't necessarily playing the role we want them to, and how do we continue to work with them, how do they work with us, and how do we build trust along that way. And I think that's something that only recently have I really heard people talk about. And also, to their credit, you mentioned just transition. I hear a lot more talk about the communications angle of that now, which is new. It used to be just a financing conversation, right? How do you move the, as you said, trillions of dollars into the global south? That conversation has to continue. But how do you message climate to people living in different countries and cultures? That's a new one that I do hear people talking about more. But I think it's one that I hope more keep doing because it hasn't been really prioritized to date. And then the last thing is I'm seeing unconventional ways, right? I'm seeing more like comedy and climate, right? Art and climate, the creative space coming in, which is really refreshing. TBD on which one of those channels is most impactful and which one of those messages resonates the most. But it's really reassuring for me to be able to see people taking these new and creative approaches and using different audiences and different tactics. And it's experimental right now, but I'm very hopeful for it.
So if you had a time machine, right, and you could go back to your 22-year-old self who's just, coming out and finishing your career in academia and embarking on your journey again, that ends up with you, convening these various climate communications projects, what would that be that bit of wisdom that you've learned across your career that you could impart to your 22-year-old self?
So a couple things. One is, and I think this might dovetail with some other kind of questions we had been thinking about ahead of time, was there, for me, there's no replacement to a one-on-one conversation with somebody that's smarter than you. There's a lot of brilliant books out there, a lot of great literature, podcasts, documentaries, etc. For me, I learn so much better when I sit down with somebody that knows an issue better than me, and I can just ask them questions in real time. For the longest time, I used to roll my eyes at that and say, whatever. As you said, I came from a decent college and I'm well read and I've got good grades. I don't need to invest as much time into relationship development and learning from others. And I know that sounds simple, but it was something that I really undervalued for a long time. And I wish I had made that a point from the day I got into college, that I was mandating myself to do it, and I didn't do enough of it. The other was, and it's not really unique to climate, but it's an investment in mental health. The work that folks like you and I do, we probably on a daily basis, unconsciously, are formulating some picture of what the future could look like, right? And oftentimes, you mentioned the Star Trek vision, right? We have these sometimes a futuristic perception of what this could be, but to go to something like Ministry of the Future style, or any number of kind of apocalyptic scenarios people paint, like it can get bleak, right? The work that we do can feel reassuring on one hand, but quite bleak on another, and it takes a toll, right? Like there's been plenty of times where I've felt way too stressed about it, put a lot of pressure on myself to figure things out faster and get things done in a more efficient way that I'm not ready to do maybe, or I'm still learning how to do. And I downplayed mental health for the longest time. I thought it was something that would just take care of itself. And I wish that I had prioritized it sooner. And that's another thing that I see is this convergence of the mental health and the climate worlds happening in a lot more real time. And, Grist runs a column with therapists that you can talk to about climate related concerns you have. And I think it's amazing. And so for those of us that are doing hard work like you and I and many others, I really am a big advocate for that. And so that's another thing that I wish I had prioritized sooner.
Something I think I still personally need to prioritize a little bit more, if I'm being honest with myself.
That's the first step.
What's the most important? What's the most important environmental message that the public needs to hear right now?
Good question. So I'll go back to what I was saying earlier, that for years we didn't really focus on adaptation resilience, ANR, right? If you look at the history of COP, only in the past few years has it really gotten on the agenda in a substantive way. And so one is we need to educate people on what this means, right? Even if we don't use those words, right? Potential Energy Coalition talks a lot about the consequences and making people understand the consequences and how they impact them. That's ANR at the individual level and at play. So educating people on just what this looks like, right? But then also, as you said, we've got to be optimistic and strike a positive tone. Educate them on the solutions for adaptation and resilience, which is also an underdeveloped area, right? Because we've underinvested in it, and because of that, we have less transparency around the solutions. And so really educating individuals and leaders, right, investors, on what these solutions are, how to invest in them, how to build them, how to scale them, et cetera. Those to me have got to be front and center for our work moving forward.
Before we go to the last question, and this again might be a bit controversial, but I mean, what say you that a focus on adaptation is essentially like giving up, and that if you're spending your whole time focusing on adaptation, you should be devoting all of that energy to, stopping the rise in carbon being burned in the first place. So what's your response to that?
Look, it's a fair question. I think this is where sometimes the binary thinking can work against us, because usually when we say focus on adaptation, the implication is stop focusing on mitigation, right? This is not an either or equation, right? Both have to be done. We're not doing enough of either, right? And we're doing far less on the adaptation front than we should be. It's a tough message to sell, right? Because it's almost like you're saying, well, wait a second, renewables are economically just more competitive. Whole host of reasons why you should own an EV that go beyond just being good for the planet, right? We have a solution set that is very well understood around mitigation, very much needed. And you can make money off of it, let's be frank, right? There's a good return on investment for renewables in particular. So that all stays true, right? But that also doesn't have as immediate term impact on us as individuals as focusing on adaptation resilience does in the near term. And so it's not either or, it's both, but a lot more of both. And it's just a tougher narrative to sell. The reason why I focus on it, because I get to work with a lot of brilliant people that are focusing on mitigation already. And so I sleep a little bit better at night knowing that. And I'm like, great, this frees me up to work on this other stuff too, right? Which is another thing I think it's important to say out loud.
And here we go. Final question. So a little thought experiment. You've got every single person whose career or job it is communicating the climate and nature crisis to whatever audience. And they're all listening to us right now. And crucially, it's just one strategy you get to pick. So what is the one unifying strategy? Not necessarily their whole job, but like that every single climate and nature communication in the world should be doing as like a baseline before all the rest of their work.
I mean, I still think that there's a huge gap between the people that are actively experiencing the worst of climate change and the people that are actively working on solving it, so to speak. You know, countries or even communities in wealthy countries, you know, the reality of a rural population, you know, I grew up in rural Southern Virginia. That reality is very, very different than the reality in Washington, D.C., where I live now, which is effectively the same state, or, you know, the same geographic area. We're only 4 or 5 hours away from where I grew up. But the way that they experience it is very, very different, right? And so I think anybody working in comms needs to get as much experience as possible with the communities that are most acutely experiencing this. Otherwise, it's just harder to tell the story, I think, in a credible way. And it's something I struggle with too, right? Because can't be everywhere at once, right? I can only visit so many countries and locations. And so it's an ongoing challenge for me too.
That's a fantastic and very interesting answer, and a unique one in the history of this podcast, which is why I love it so much, asking the same questions each week, and the different answers that come out are so invigorating. So Jamil, it's been like a really tremendous hour. I've had such a good time, and thank you so much for all the work that you do and for your time today.
This was excellent, Tom. This was a really, really good conversation, and kudos to you and the team for doing this, and thanks a lot for having me on.